Okay, so take a second and prepare a new quad chart, a bitter stalemate. We're still in the Korean War, and picking up where our last lesson left off, General MacArthur has launched a breakout of Pusan, or initially part of the breakout of Pusan, where he's moved people around to the Incheon landings and is poised to assault and liberate Seoul and then separate really the attack from major of North Korea to the attacking forces that are down around Pusan. So our essential question today is, what was the impact of China's entry into the Korean War, which is going to happen relatively quickly after MacArthur gets what he wants out of this. So after the Incheon landings, we rapidly move into Seoul, South Korea. We have bitter house-to-house urban combat that's happening there. It's bloody and devastating to both sides. The North releases several T-34 tanks, which make that approach fairly difficult and make the actual clearing of the town very, very difficult. Seoul's a huge city, by the way, so it would take some time to do that. Ultimately, the commander there declares Seoul as liberated, and the UN forces begin their breakout of the perimeter down in Pusan. Once this happens, MacArthur pretty much cuts off all of those forces in the south, and the North Korean forces are in complete, in utter disarray. They've lost communication. They have no logistical support for from their forces further north of them. The remainder of the army is in full retreat, which allows really us to focus on the army units that have remained in the south, and the losses that the North Koreans witness at this point in time is very, very close to what the South Koreans witnessed on the initial invasion by the North. They just can't deal with the American superiority in technology. They've got numbers of troops. They outnumbered the South, but they can't deal with the combat experience. Many of these men that fought in Korea were World War II veterans and had a lot of experience that the North Koreans didn't have. So MacArthur pushes really, really far north and threatens to invade China. He doesn't. He claims he never intended to invade China, but in only a couple of months, he reaches the Yalu River, which is the border between North Korea and China. And this really makes the Chinese uncomfortable. So Chairman Mao warns internationally that if China is invaded, they will intervene. That warning goes really ignored by MacArthur, although he had no plans to invade China himself. He was going to halt south of the Yalu River. He wanted to definitely push all the way back and take over North Korea in what's really the first ever land invasion of a communist country. And I think that played into a lot of what made Chairman Mao uncomfortable. He responds with committing just over 500,000 troops to combat in North Korea, which changes drastically what's going on. If you see, here is the landings at Incheon on this map. The initial red lines down here are the threat and push down to Pusan by the North Koreans. Once they're cut off, MacArthur quickly, within a couple of months, goes all the way to the Yalu and pushes almost all the way, taking territory that belonged to North Korea, which is what resulted in the intervention, obviously. And they do this overnight. They do it without any indication on the ground of a Chinese attack. And one of the places we are really caught by surprise is the Chosin Reservoir. So if you see this map, Battle of Chosin Reservoir, everything in blue are U.S. forces. There are about 30,000 U.S. forces, predominantly United States Marines, here in the Chosin Reservoir. And the main area we're going to focus on is Udam-ni right there. Everything in red, you can see there's a division of Chinese that are maintaining this high ground and have access and routes all the way in to attack the Americans. The result of this is really devastating. The men didn't know it was going to happen, and in fact, they were bedded down at the time, and they were awoken by buglers. Buglers were signaling the attack for the Chinese. So as they attacked, the Marines jumped up, manned battle positions, and began fighting. But they were quickly swarmed and outnumbered by 120,000 Chinese fighters. So 30,000 Marines to 120,000 Chinese, not a very good odd if you're fighting on the U.S. side that day. They consolidated at Udamni, and they began an evacuation. Meanwhile, the Chinese stayed on this high ground and continued harassing fire as the Marines spent 17 days fighting their way out of the Chosin Reservoir. And there's some things really contribute to one of the most brutal battles the Marines have ever fought in. Number one is this rough terrain. If you look at this, all this dark kind of reddish color here is 1,500 meters above sea level. So you've got a 4,500 foot increase in elevation from where the Marines were in the Chosin Reservoir and on the roads fighting their way out. So everywhere along the way, they were within range of high angle Chinese machine gun and mortar fire, and it's just devastating on how they were able to get out of there. Another thing, it was one of the harshest winters ever experienced in Korea. They just dealt with a massive Siberian cold front that settled down on this area, and the temperatures those nights dipped to 35 below zero. And in 35 below zero, blood plasma products freeze, so you can't give transfusions to guys who need it when they're losing blood in a gunfight. The Jeep batteries died. The lubricants on machine guns gummed up, and they weren't able to work very well. Morphine froze. So men who were wounded in excruciating pain couldn't take morphine, and they experienced really severe frostbite because they weren't prepared for that kind of cold. On the good side, that kind of cold had an effect that saved people's lives. And as they experienced both amputations and gunshot wounds, it was so cold that the blood coagulated and actually stopped bleeding, so that these guys were able to spend a day, some of them 2 or more days, being evacuated out of there to receive treatment. When they got back into a field hospital, they were warmed up inside the tents. They would start bleeding again. Some men who'd been patched up had wounds that started bleeding again that the doctors didn't know about. So as they would be working and operating on someone, they'd start bleeding in other locations. But ultimately, the cold, while very devastating, I'm sure, and bad to have served in, saved some of these men's lives. The Chinese made several mistakes. They had poor intelligence on exact locations of where the Marines were. They allowed the Marines to assemble at Udamni, and really that assembly and consolidation allowed them to maintain their forces together and protect them all the way out. And the Chinese came in themselves without enough winter gear. So look at these totals of this one battle, the initial battle really of the Chinese involvement in the Korean War. Outnumbering Americans 120,000 to 30,000, the Chinese lost almost 30,000 people, equal to the number of forces that the Americans had there, while we only lost just over 1,000 killed and about 4,000 missing in action. Not near the potential for what we could have lost in that mission, that battle. And the ultimate result of this is not a win or a loss for either side, but it gives the North Koreans hope that the Chinese are there to attack, the Chinese are there to support them, and in doing so would drive the Americans out, which is really what this propaganda is showing. It's Chinese propaganda showing how badly they've defeated the Americans at the Chosin Reservoir. And China really plays a big part. I mean, they become the primary communist belligerent now. The North is really not contributing anything, and China continues sending division after division after division into North Korea, conducting 5 operations over the next 6 months or so, taking land all the way down beyond Seoul. Now, again, if you look at this historically, when the North invaded, they get all the way down here to Busan. MacArthur attacks and goes in and liberates Seoul with the Incheon landings, cuts them off, and goes all the way back up to the Yalu. And within a number of months, the Chinese have taken almost all that territory back, definitely past what's known as North Korea and over to the capital of South Korea. More looks at just the spring offensive of the Chinese army. Everything in blue is the American 8th Army divided by corps along these lines, and then assaults coming all along through here just outside of Seoul. And again, the primary goal of President Truman is to liberate Seoul, maintain democracy in the South. So that's where the majority of the force is is concentrated. And what we're fighting really is an unlimited enemy, where they suffer in technology, where they don't have the best leadership and tactics. They make up for that by just sending wave after wave after wave. And in similar to the video I showed you guys about the Battle of Stalingrad, where everybody didn't have a gun, the Chinese send entire units out on the ground unarmed, and they're expected to pick up weapons off the battlefield and continue to fight. And they just, wave after wave after wave of humans coming across the border. It's honestly fairly impressive that they were able to convince people to do things in that matter. The Russians are providing 90% of the Chinese logistical supports at this point, because China cannot provide it themselves. And ultimately, the result of this is they have repelled the United Nations offensive that gets all the way up to the Yalu, and they continue further and further south. Here's a more Chinese propaganda. This is a caricature of General MacArthur with that, the MacArthur hat is what it's referred to, kind of dragging the American flag and walking away while the Chinese are coming in and crushing him. So a lot of propaganda comes out of this. But what does MacArthur do, right? MacArthur begins a scorched earth policy. And we remember what that is from what happened in the Rape of Nanking, right? It's when you destroy everything that can be used by the enemy. You burn it, you contaminate it, you just make sure that nothing can ever be used. This is not limited war. And this is not what MacArthur knows. MacArthur understands total war. So that's what he's doing. He emphasizes this massive bombing campaign, primarily using napalm, right? So he uses over 1 million tons of napalm. 18 out of 22 North Korean cities are completely destroyed. All North Korean cities and the infrastructure is 80 to 90% destroyed. He then goes to Truman, and he argues for using 10 to 20 tactical atomic weapons, right? The size of Hiroshima nuclear weapons. And what he wants to do is not destroy cities with them. He wants to deny area. So an area denial weapon is one in which you would put it out there, not with the intent of killing people, but with the intent, in this case, of contaminating an area so that the Chinese couldn't come through, the North Koreans couldn't fight through. And he would use them along the border with North Korea in key cities in China. And this would channelize the Chinese military if they were going to come through. And he would do it in places where he would be stronger and he would be able to fight the Chinese armies if they came through. There's a lot of misconception that when MacArthur said he wanted to use nukes in North Korea, he wanted to nuke China and nuke Chinese cities. That wasn't the case. The case is that he wanted to use them in a tactical manner to set up the battlefield for where he could fight them. Using a scorched earth policy resulted in this type of North Korean propaganda. This is what they told everybody we were doing to the people there. And this is probably the way a lot of North Koreans felt about American involvement, because MacArthur was fighting total war, because that's what he understood and what he knew how to do. Truman wasn't on board, right? Truman was fighting a limited war campaign. That's what he was into. So MacArthur openly starts criticizing this policy, and because he doesn't understand it, right? He understands how to win and win at all costs. And Truman disagrees with that. That's why Truman declines the offer or the request for using the nuclear weapons, and ultimately begins this massive distrust of General MacArthur. Now, MacArthur had spent the last 10 or 12 years in the Pacific. He was the expert. He knew everything. But in the division between our civilian and military leadership, and the way that the president, as a civilian leader, is also the commander-in-chief of the military forces, there can be no room for separation in policy. Truman's policy had to become MacArthur's policy. That didn't happen. This has happened several times in warfare. Most recently, President Obama and General Stanley McChrystal had a difference of opinion and a difference in policy on how things should happen in Afghanistan, and a similar result comes out of that. President Obama calls General MacArthur back to Washington. Or President Obama calls General McChrystal back to Washington, D.C. and relieves him of command. Truman does this also to General MacArthur. He calls him back to Washington, D.C. He relieves him of command, and he replaces him with General Ridgway, who's very influential in the European conflict in World War II, a great military leader, and he's tasked with going in and reestablishing the line. And that's exactly what Ridgway does. He reestablishes a forward line of troops, and he starts defending against anything North Korea or the Chinese have to bring at him. But it really starts to resemble the trench warfare and attrition warfare that we experienced in World War I. So we dig in along the 38th parallel, cut the communist supply lines, and attempt to begin a new offensive. But really what we see at this point in time are just skirmishes back and forth as President Truman tries to negotiate a peace settlement, which doesn't happen initially, but he tries to negotiate this peace settlement with Chinese forces who have become really, really tired of fighting along that 38th parallel with the Americans.